Good evening. It's always an honor to stand up here and get to talk to you guys. You're such a lovely, well-read, beautiful group. I'm just happy to be here. Today, I've been given the charge of talking about the prodigal son, and of course, every single one of you knows this backwards and forwards. You've heard this parable since you were a little kid, so you probably are thinking, what could you possibly be about to tell me that I don't already know about this parable? I've read it so many times, and so I'm going to try to put my little twist on it and bring something to you that might be interesting. I'm always sort of amazed at how complicated we are. I mean, every single one of you is only as complicated as the person that's sitting next to you, and I can't possibly try to understand or even fathom the inner workings of you, okay? I mean, you know that you can't even tell yourself what to do. Like, you have a nature, right? You can't even tell yourself what to do. You wake up this morning, you say, I'm going to do A, B, and C, good things, and then you go to bed at night and you didn't do any of them, and you did X, Y, and Z things that weren't so good. So you have a nature to yourself. You can't tell yourself what to do. You have these thoughts inside of you. Where do they come from? I mean, some of them are amazing and beautiful, and well thought out and interesting, and then there are other ones that are so horrible. You're like, how did that come out of my brain? Where did that come from? You're so complicated, but what's so cool about you at the same time is that you know it. You know this, and so you say, what is wrong with me? Why am I like this? And why did God make us like this? And sometimes I think we need a little bit of in this little human experience that we have, we need a little bit of guidance along the way. You know, speaking of weird thoughts that come to your mind, I actually woke up this morning. This was so strange. I knew I was going to be doing this today, and something popped into my head. I just woke up, and the first thought that came to my head was, sometimes you're lost, and you didn't even know you were lost. Like, you thought you were on the right path, and you're lost. So I've been thinking about that all day long, and then I thought about this thing that happened to me one time. So when I was about 16 years old, I may have mentioned this before, I used to play this weird instrument called the bassoon, which is like this instrument that you only see played in like symphony orchestras. And when I was a kid, I was blessed by God to have some talent at this, and so I was pretty good at it. And I thought for a while there, this might be what I want to do for my career. And I thought, well, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. Now, I had a lesson teacher at the time, and she was really good to me, and she was good to me for years. She got me where I was. But I was 16 years old, and I thought, well, if I'm going to be the best, I got to take lessons from the best. Well, we live in Houston, and we house the Houston Symphony, and so we have, no shortage of amazing musicians in the Houston Symphony. And so I knew who the principal bassoon player was of the Houston Symphony. Back then, his name was Benjamin Kamens, and I thought, he was my hero. I knew everything about this guy. I'd heard him play many times. Of course, he didn't know who I was, but I had heard him play many times, and he was like my hero. And so I thought to myself, I'm going to ask Benjamin Kamens to give me lessons. And so, as you guys all know, I was going to say if the youth was here, I was going to try to describe to them the white pages or the yellow or the telephone book, how people actually used to publish their own telephone number in a book that anyone could see. Well, that's what I did. I took the Greater Houston white pages and I opened it up, and then lo and behold, his number was there. So I picked up the phone and I dialed the number, and he answered. And I said, so I introduced myself. I said, my name's Kyle Gordley. I just told him a little about what I had accomplished so far, and I said, I would be honored if you'd give me lessons. And there was a long pause. And he was like, who are you again? So I described who I was, I said who I was, and he said, who's your lesson teacher? Who's your private lesson teacher? And I told him who it was, and he said, okay, I know who that is. And then he said, well, son, I don't give lessons to high school students. And I said, well, I was hoping you could make an exception on my behalf. Amen. And there was another long pause, and he said, is this really what you want to do? Is this what you want to do with your life? Are you sure? And I was 16 years old, so I said, well, I think so. I mean, I'm not really sure. I think it might be what I want to do. And he said, well, when I was 19 years old, I was already in my first symphony. And when I was your age, I knew. So I'm asking you again, do you know for sure this is what you want to do? And again, I kind of gave him the same stumbling, bumbling answer because it was true. I didn't know. And long story short, the conversation kind of petered out. And I hung up the phone, and I went about my 16-year-old way. The phone rings 20 minutes later, and it's my private lesson teacher. Says, did you just call Benjamin Kamens of the Houston Symphony? So that really happened, and I think about that story for a couple of reasons. One, because how bold was I? I mean, like, how courageous was I as a kid? I mean, I'm like, I don't have that now. I don't know where that went, but it's kind of gone. I mean, I never would do something like that now, but back then, no problem. But the other thing is that guy probably didn't realize it, but he changed my life. I mean, it's not like he told me not to do it. He just asked me a question. That's all he did. And he kind of sent me on my way, and he kind of changed my life. And I've always thought about him and would thank him if he was here. But so I think of Jesus' parables being kind of like that, is sometimes we need a little bit of a nudge in the right direction, and that's why those stories are there. And so, of course, you can't really talk about the story of the prodigal son unless you talk about this word prodigal, right? And does anybody know what this word really means? It means wastefully extravagant. Now, that's not the words of Luke, and I don't think that's the words of Jesus either, but somebody at some point in time assigned that word to this story. And my question is that, does that really have anything to do with this story or not? My contention is that it doesn't. And so we're going to come back to that, so hold on to that thought. And so to me, all these parables are all sort of like onions, right? So you peel back layers, and we try to assign new meanings to Jesus' words, okay? But I read a lot of commentaries about this one, and I thought to myself, it's not that I disagree with what these guys are saying, but I think sometimes they're missing the point. So I decided, I'm not going to read any more commentaries. I'm just going to read this parable as if I was sitting there listening to it, and maybe I was one of the Pharisees. And I'm just going to see how my mind reacts when I read it. Because are we supposed to separate out the three parables? Because one of them is the parable of the lost sheep, one of them is the parable of the lost coin, and the other one's the parable of the lost son. Are we supposed to separate them out? Or are we supposed to keep them together like Jesus said them? Well, I think we're supposed to keep them together. And so it's all about the context. So we're going to read from Luke 15. So he who has ears, hear. So now the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and he eats with them." So everything else that we're going to talk about is in the context of Jesus responding to this accusation that he eats with sinners. Now, I put this picture up here because probably right now you may be squirming in your seat, because every single one of you at some point in time has had to, well, you all have to pay taxes. Everyone here has to pay taxes, and so you know this. Now, I've never been audited, and knock on wood, I hope that I never have to be audited, but I kind of thought that, if I was to come across one of these government tax workers, that I probably wouldn't hate them. Now, I might be kind of irritated about the situation, and I might even be kind of afraid about what might happen, but I probably wouldn't hate them. But now imagine that this person that's come to your home is a cousin of yours, and he's using all of his knowledge and power to trick you into increasing the amount that you pay for your taxes. Let's imagine that he gets his tough guy friends to help make you pay them. And now let's imagine that he's wearing an Armani suit with a Rolex watch, and he drives away in a Bentley. Well, that's basically what was going on back then. And these guys were hated, these tax collectors, because it wasn't like they were employees of the Roman government. The Roman government said, look, we want this much tax from these Jewish people. You pay us these taxes, and then you can just get reimbursed by the people however you see fit. You want to overcharge them? Go for it. You've got us behind you. No problem. And so that's basically what these guys were. Is they were Jewish opportunists. Okay, they were just taking advantage of the situation, and people hated them. And they cheated people. There's no doubt about it. If you don't believe that, Zacchaeus even mentions it. He says, "Well, Jesus, if I cheated anybody, I'll pay them back 4 times as much as." Right. So we know that they were cheaters. Nobody liked them. I always kind of assumed that they must be hanging around with each other in cliques, because whenever we hear about tax collectors, it's always in the plural, right? And they certainly seem to be hanging around with Jesus some, so that makes me think that they probably all were hanging around with Matthew, and Matthew was around Jesus, and there you go. And then I came across this interesting thought, and that's that, Matthew's tent was by Capernaum, which is by the Sea of Galilee, and he was taxing probably the fishing industry. Well, how many of the disciples made their money off the sea? 4 of them. So 4 of them were probably regularly getting cheated by him. And then also you had this other guy named Simon the Zealot, who was just an extremist. This group was a violent anti-Roman extremist, and they were, at least as I read, they were known for even assassinating tax collectors. So that must have been a nice little interaction between all the disciples, right? But Jesus put them together. So we know he hung around with tax collectors, and we know that the Pharisees hated it. And so what would the Pharisees' interaction would have been like with the tax collectors? Well, probably not too good. Would have probably been a lot of condemnation, probably would have been a lot of rules and things. But Jesus wouldn't have treated those guys like that. And I think that's why they were so attracted to him, is that he would have offered them forgiveness. They were getting that from the Pharisees. And, Jesus loved to dig into the Pharisees with that too. He says, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you." So let's keep reading. Then Jesus told them this parable. "Suppose that one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I found my lost sheep.' I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over the 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent." Now, when I think of that story, I think of being kind of a math and science guy. I think of the 1%. So he makes the point that this is one sheep out of 100 and that it's 1%. And if you were lucky enough to go find 1% of your wealth, that would be an exciting thing. And I think this is a setup. Like Jesus is setting the story up. He's going to build this up. And I think everybody that was listening to the story, Pharisees included, would have given this a thumbs up so far. Yep, you lost 1% of your wealth. You're lucky enough to find it. You're going to celebrate. That's an exciting thing. And so then he keeps going. He winds it up a little bit. He goes, "Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And then when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I found my lost coin.' In the same way I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of angels of God over one sinner who repents." And so this kind of, again, the math guy says to me, okay, now we're upping it a little bit. We're going from 1%, now we're up to 10%. Okay, so now 10% of our wealth is lost, but it's close by. And I don't think that's by accident that Jesus says that. It's not just that we found it far away before, but now it's close by. So that means something that is close by can be lost. So he's setting that up for you. Even things that can be close by can be lost. The loss is not far from you, but it's still lost. At this point, everybody is in agreement, I would think, so far. They're starting to make this connection. Okay, we're lost. The finder is God. I get that. The values are going up. We should be more excited with each subsequent story. Correct. But then Jesus absolutely ups up one more time. Now there's a man that has 2 sons. Well, I have 2 sons. So I was thinking about that. Well, it's one thing to lose 1% of your wealth or 10% of your wealth, but one of your sons or 50% of your sons? I certainly can imagine a situation where if I lost one of my sons and he was reclaimed, how much I would rejoice and how excited I would be. It's not hard for me to follow the story so far, but that's when Jesus does an absolute plot twist, right? Because yes, one of the sons is lost, but he's awful. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me a share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Now, I don't care whether this is, ancient times or whether this is 2023, United States of America. If you tell your father that you'd rather have his inheritance now, you're basically telling him that you'd wish he was dead. So this is a slap in the face, no matter what culture you live in, not only your father, but to your brother and to the whole family. And not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, and he set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. And then I thought, well, why in the world would a Jewish person want to leave Israel? Why would you leave the promised land, the land of milk and honey? Again, he's awful. This is just not something that would be done. It doesn't make any sense. Everybody hearing the story would be saying, ooh. And after that, he had spent everything. There was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. Now, a lot of times we think about the idea of pigs as in, should we eat them, should we not eat them? That comes up a lot. But here, it's even worse than that because he's feeding them, but he's also coveting what they eat. He's in the slop with them. So again, it's as bad as it can get, or as bad as Jesus can describe. And he's awful, but he's still 50% of his father's sons. And when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and he went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. By the way, that's another thing that Jewish patriarchs don't do. They don't run. They don't get up and run. As I read, that's apparently a strange thing for them back then, but that's not something that they did. But here, obviously, he missed him enough to actually see him from far off. So he must have been looking. And the son says to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Now, the Pharisees at this point, they're not stupid. They probably see what's going on here. This story is not unfolding like it was before. And that Jesus is putting them to the test. He's putting them to it. Are you going to save this boy who's awful? Or are you going to stone him? And that's the question that he's putting to them. Right then and there as they're hearing it. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. And let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. So they began to celebrate. And so I was thinking about this idea when I was a kid. I never really understood this part about the robe, and the ring and the sandals, but I get it now. I mean, servants don't wear sandals. He wasn't just bringing the boy back into the home. He was reestablishing, restoring him to 100% like he was before. And the big question with that is that even as a kid, as I read that, it always seemed like, is he really doing that? Is that just? Is that fair? Is that what I would do? It always seemed a little bit outrageous to me. But that's the point, is that Jesus is saying that God's willing and able to do that. He misses you. He misses you so much. He's willing to restore you to 100%. So, what an amazing story. The story should be over, right? I mean, if the story really is called The Prodigal Son, is it not over? I mean, isn't this a story about the amazing grace of God and his ability to restore this awful son back to his full glory? This should be the next story, right? But no, this is where Jesus decides to really turn the knife on these Pharisees. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field, and he came near the house, and he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants, and he asked him, what was going on? Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. And the older brother became angry and refused to go in, so his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, and I never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. And when I hear this part of the story, I always think that Jesus is really looking in the eyes of the Pharisees, and he's saying, you guys look like you're spot on. You look like you're doing everything right, but you are yelling and screaming at God. You're yelling and screaming at him. My son, the father said, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because the brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. And so I was thinking to myself, what is it? If I was put it in lay terms, like what is Jesus saying after all? Who is he talking to? What's he saying? I think he's saying to the Pharisees, this whole story is, you don't like that I sit and eat with sinners? What about you? I tell you the story of this boy that's awful. And he repents and he's restored and you don't care. You are the elder brother. You're close to God, but you're lost. You're like that lost coin. And you're doomed, and you don't even know it. It's like, stop obsessing over all these rules and ask God to restore you because of your pride. You may not be far from God, but you are still lost. And what would be the Pharisees' reaction here? I mean, it doesn't say, but is it, yeah, you're right, Jesus. We should repent for our self-righteousness and Or is it that this man, Jesus, must die? Are you sure that he's not talking to you in this story? Now, when I was a kid, I always even still, I really don't think of myself as the younger son in the story. I never really have thought that applied to me. And I'm not saying much about myself, although I always was sort of a straight arrow. So I don't think that part of the story really applies to me. And if maybe many of you are like that as well, but don't be confused about thinking that this story is about some old stuffy lawyer from 2,000 years ago. Because if any one of you thought that restoring that son was just a little too much, more than he deserved, if you feel like that, if you feel that's a little bit much, then this story is for you. Then Jesus is talking to you. If you like checklists, if you like, look, I go to church on Sundays and I go on Wednesdays and I teach classes and I donate my time and I do all of these things that are on the checklist. But you've ever thought to yourself, yeah, there's some people that don't do that. Have you ever thought that? This story's for you. Have you ever shook your head or shook your fist at the sky and said, man, I follow all the rules. How come I'm not being blessed like I think I should be? If you've ever had that thought, then this story is for you. This parable is for you. Have you ever put yourself up on a pedestal? Now, I must admit, usually once a month I go to the Impact Church on behalf of Woodland Oaks, and I give underwear out to what we call them the outdoorsmen that are down there. And just being around those men and women, you can't help but put yourself on a pedestal because it's about as low as it gets. And it's hard not to do that. And so I fight that every time I go down there. And so this story is talking to me. It's talking about pride. Do you ever rationalize your purity? You say, look, man, I'm more good than I am bad. I do more good things than I do harmful things. If you ever think that, this story's for you. You ever watch the nightly news? I don't even know if anybody watches it anymore because it's so awful. But if you do watch the nightly news and you see all the awful sin going on in this world and you sit and you say to yourself, well, there's a lot of sin out there, but I'm here safe at home, then this story is for you. I've certainly been lost, and I'm sure at times when I thought I was on the right path, I've certainly been lost, and there's certainly been many times where I prayed to God for my sinful past. But how many times do you guys pray to God for your prideful past? Do you do that? I think this parable should be the parable of the proud son, because that's what it's about. That's who Jesus was talking to. He's talking to the Pharisees, but he's talking to us too. And again, it's the same with the coin. You may not be far from God, but you can still be lost. I thank you guys so much for your thoughts. I'm just going to finish with the prayer.